The great temple of Amun-Ra in the site of Karnak, in the ancient city of Thebes, is the grandest of all Egyptian temples. It was not built upon one complete plan, but owes its size, disposition, and magnificence to the work of many kings. It is placed in an immense enclosure along with other ancillary temples that got built over time and a sacred lake, all surrounded by a wall 9 meters thick, and it is connected by an avenue of sphinxes with the temple of Luxor. You can see how the notion of axis and procession that was already established in the journey from the Valley Temple through the causeway to the pyramid is transformed in this new building type, Egyptian temple. And in fact, the procession begins long before you ever penetrate this big gate. We have an avenue lined with sphinxes, ram-headed lion figures, each protecting a small pharaoh figure between their paws. And before you even get to the sphinxes, we see these 2 stone needles called obelisks over here. Obelisks were commemorative landmarks for pharaohs made out of a single piece of stone. And in some temples behind the obelisks, we see colossal statues. So there are many things stretching out to the desert, enforcing the notion of procession, enforcing the idea of the axis and the gate. The gate in Egyptian temples is called a pylon, and they're interesting forms because in part they're wall-like, defining the edge of a precinct, but they're also gate-like, permitting the axis to thread through. The Temple of Amun-Ra had 6 pairs of pylons added by successive rulers, and consists of various courts and halls leading to the sanctuary, and a large ceremonial hall by Thutmose III in the rear. If you look at the pylon, you might ask, why does it have that shape? Well, again, Egyptian architecture is mimetic of a vernacular way of building. Vernacular means common to the people, so vernacular architecture is the common popular way of building. When I talked about the step pyramid of Zoser up in the Nile Delta, we saw that there was a vernacular way of building that had to do with reeds and mud, and kind of weaving an architecture that then got picked up in the stone articulation of the buildings. Here in Karnak, we don't have the same growth of river reeds, and the vernacular architecture might have been mud brick. And if you want to build a mud wall, it gets thicker toward the base and tapers more toward the top, and you begin to get that message recapitulated in the characteristic form of the pylon. When you penetrate the main pylon, you'll arrive to a great courtyard with rows of columns on both sides, and with a channel of columns in the center enforcing the axis of the temple and the notion of procession. To the right is the temple of Ramesses III, whose courtyard has columns with statues of the pharaoh attached. The feeling of just walking inside this small temple is from another world, as it has some inscriptions that are well preserved. Some still have traces of color even. If we go back to the main courtyard of the Amun-Ra temple, you can see that there are many sphinxes in the lateral side. These used to be part of the Sphinx Avenue in the entrance, but were relocated when the pylons were built. Beyond the courtyard is the second pylon, which gives entrance to the vast hypostyle hall built by Seti I and his son Ramesses II. This is the great hypostyle hall in the temple of Amun-Ra. A hypostyle hall is a covered architectural enclosure supported by rows of large columns placed closely together, which can resemble a forest of columns. The roof of enormous slabs of stone is supported by 134 columns in 16 rows. The central avenues are about 24 meters in height and have columns 21 meters high and 3.6 meters in diameter, with capitals of the papyrus flower, while the side avenues are lower, with columns 13 meters high and 2.7 meters in diameter. So the central avenue is taller in order to admit light through the clerestory, which are these huge windows on the sides. We don't see this method of clerestory lighting fully developed again until the Middle Ages in the Gothic cathedrals in Europe. The scale of Egyptian architecture is astonishing. You go there and you really do feel something extraordinary. You have an overwhelming reaction to how small you are and how big this architecture is. And that sense of being overwhelmed by an experience of landscape or architecture is called the sublime. You can see that the columns are really close together. The tight spacing was necessary because stone cannot span very far. But it's also great, it's just as the physical experience of being around these huge columns and getting the shade of the columns is breathtaking. All these columns were carved with inscriptions and reliefs in color, and give names of royal personages who contributed to its grandeur, and praise the gods to whom it was dedicated. The color has mostly disappeared, but you can still see here and there a few traces of it in the architecture. Beyond this point, the temple becomes more ruinous and harder to follow, but several major features stand out, such as the obelisk of Hatshepsut, which is one of the largest obelisks in Egypt, and the Sancta Sanctorum, the sanctuary of the temple, where the statue of Ammon was placed. If you continue your way toward the right, you'll find the sacred lake, which was used by priests for ritual washing and ritual navigation. And you'll also find these precincts with more pylons. But it's worth looking for a moment at how disorganized this plan is. I mean, we get the Amun-Ra temple behaving in a fairly normative way, and this axis is perpendicular to the Nile River, which is way over here. And so there is that same journey along the causeway from the funerary barge taking you in there. Then we get certain other temples like this one, where the pylons are not behaving quite so axially as we would expect from the Egyptians. And the reason for that is a large engagement of the site is being responded to. Here it's all about the Nile and the path, the procession. Here it's all about making a connection to another temple precinct, a pre-existing temple complex. So sometimes when you start analyzing buildings, you might look at something and you can't find a way of making sense out of it. Like, why is this thing so messy? But if you find a site plan and you find information, you might get it. That the local condition is compromised to make sense out of the regional condition or the larger site idea. So some of those things are happening over here. Let's look at the type of Middle and New Kingdom Egyptian temple. Temples were of two main classes: the mortuary temples for ministrations to deified pharaohs, and cult temples for the popular worship of ancient gods. But by the New Kingdom, both mortuary and cult temples had most features in common. We have some constituent parts that are conserved regardless of how much difference we have, like the notion of the threshold, the pylon, that begins to structure a procession in a hierarchical fashion. You can read the pylons in plan because they are these massively thick walls, and then you get a series of hypostyle halls that you can also read in plan because they are these halls full of columns. Constituent parts laid out in quite different ways spatially, but nonetheless close enough to the normative type to deserve that title of Egyptian temple. This is the Temple of Khonsu, located here in a corner of the Amun-Ra complex. And this one's good to look at because it's so clear. The Amun-Ra temple is so big and messy that it's hard to read the type and its clarity. If we look closely to these temples, we can begin to see ideas of organization that go beyond the simple notion that there's a big axis. We see how hierarchy is established by this telescoping scale. And by telescoping scale, I mean spaces gathered together and made more and more condensed. So we have the world out here, we have the channel of space here, we have a courtyard surrounded by a double colonnade on three sides. We have this hall full of columns called hypostyle hall, smaller chambers that become more and more condensed, like a telescope. So the size of the space in plan enforces a sense that this is hierarchically more and more exclusive. And if you look at the section, this telescoping action is happening in two ways. The floor is stepping up, the roof is stepping down, you're getting more and more compressed. So as you penetrate and move forward through the temple, you keep walking through increasingly darker, increasingly smaller rooms that have lower and lower ceilings. And at the end, there was a statue of Ammon and his solar vessel that were processioned throughout the city, dressed in rich garments and smeared with ointments and perfumes. So the sanctuary felt like a small, dark, and silent place, just like the humid and silent depths of the earth, where Ammon, the subterranean and hidden god, got his power. If you'd like to see some of the pictures I took in these amazing sites, go follow me on Instagram because I've been posting a lot of images from Egypt and from other incredible places. Thanks for watching, please support me with a like, and I'll see you very soon. Goodbye.
Esa dicha es el gran mensaje, por eso se dicen que es el gran faraón. Un mensaje al pueblo para levantar la moral o levantar el sentimiento patrio.